Good evening. Welcome to the View Up Here. I'm your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is September 4th, 2019. Holidays are over. Tonight, will the Pallister Devastation of Manitoba bring electoral reset with James Wilt? Manitoba votes on September 10th in its 39th provincial election to fill the 57 seats of the Legislature. But despite a fixed election date law, Premier Brian Pallister has chosen to go to the polls over a year earlier than necessary. Why, you may ask? Some opinions lead towards the conservative grand game plan of solidifying enough provincial governments to enable the possible amendment of the Canadian Constitution with a federal conservative win this October. Some opinions point to the building protest and resistance against his austerity measures, requiring a new mandate to continue with any seeming legitimacy. There is no question about the turmoil the Pallister government has caused in 3 years. Healthcare has seen strikes and consolidation as facilities close and wait times grow. Education has seen ideological interference linked to funding. Environmental policy has disappeared with little regard. Social programs have been slashed, addiction grows, and adequate housing and services disappear as privatization spreads. Indigenous policy has hit a low point as issues continue to grow. Nothing has been immune as the Premier of Costa Rica plays the role of father knows best. Is there a viable alternative in Manitoba? James Wilt is a freelance journalist and graduate student based in Winnipeg and can be found on Twitter. Well, I'm not going to read out his handle, but it's there on the show page. Just search James Wilt, W-I-L-T. You'll find him. He has written for the Narwhal, Vice Canada, the Globe and Mail, Briar Patch, and National Observer. He's currently working on a book about public transportation for Between the Lines Books. Now, James joins the View Up Here to analyze and discuss the Manitoba election based on his comprehensive piece in Canadian Dimension titled The Devastation of Manitoba, an autopsy of Pallister's austerity regime. Now, that article is linked on the show page. It is the big part of what we're talking about here on this show. I encourage you to read it if you have any interest at all. Now, have a little bit of time to spare, but not a whole lot, so I'm not going to waste your time. Here is the interview with James Wilt. Enjoy. The View Up Here is pleased to welcome James Wilt to the show to discuss this Manitoba election. Welcome to the show, James.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. Now, Manitoba is not one of the more well-known or well-populated provinces in Canada, although it has a long history and a very important part in Canada. Could you, for the listeners, maybe give a brief summary of where Manitoba is in 2019?
Yeah, and I think it is important to kind of start there because Manitoba sometimes does get forgotten in the bigger picture of Canada. So in 2018, there was 1.3 million people in Manitoba, and just over 750,000 of those were living in Winnipeg. So it makes it the only province in Canada with more than 55% of its population in a single city. And so that alone is kind of interesting from a political perspective. The legislature is obviously here in the biggest city, comes with sort of all the political issues adjacent to that. It's a fast-growing city and province, and it's the province itself is 17% Indigenous, and there's also large immigrant populations such as Filipino, South Asian, Chinese, and Black from Africa. And so, like I said, Winnipeg's the biggest city, but there's also Brandon with 47,000 people. There's Steinbach, which is 14,000 people. And then there's Thompson, which is, it's to the north. It's a mining town, and that's about 12,000 people. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting province. There's a lot of different dynamics. You've got agriculture in the south, you've got mining in the north, as is the case in a lot of provinces. And the territories, it's very under-resourced. There's been very little infrastructure investments. And if it is brought up politically, it's often kind of, just to score points and not really serious commitments from politicians. And so that's something I think will come up kind of in our conversation is, how the North is viewed and how it is prioritized or not prioritized. So that's kind of the very general context of Manitoba.
Well, I have had the pleasure in the past of being to Brandon, Steinbach, and Winnipeg, but by no means could I say that, I have any sort of definite opinion or expertise or anything along the lines in Manitoba. I mean, yeah, I do find it interesting that being where it is, right in the center of Canada, like I said, having such a historical role in the creation of the country, do you think being a Manitoban that the province gets ignored too much on the big picture, or is that just really the reality of the numbers of Canada?
I think it is a bit to do with the numbers, because obviously, you have Ontario, Quebec, BC, Alberta. These are all, really big powerhouse provinces. And like, even if you look at kind of what people do in Manitoba, I'm sometimes asked by people who come to visit, what do people actually do here? And I'm always kind of at a loss. I'm like, I don't actually know. So I did look it up, in terms of what people do. And a lot of it is, in real estate and in finance and insurance and in those kind of industries. But there are some pretty major issues here, which I think we'll get into in our conversation. But the history of hydroelectricity in the north, like alongside Quebec and BC, what's gone on in Manitoba over the past half century is in a very, very important, and I think kind of not very well understood in the bigger picture. And also, issues like incarceration. Manitoba has the highest per capita incarceration rate in the country, predominantly Indigenous. And because of the fact that there is a higher percentage of Indigenous peoples in Winnipeg and Manitoba, I think there are a lot of issues around like poverty and, unemployment and racism and all these kind of things, which I think are important to look at. And I think because it is smaller and it's kind of, it's just considered to be, like kind of in the realm of, maritime provinces, like, it's kind of thought of or talked about as often as that. So I think that's unfortunate. Not to say the maritime shouldn't be talked about either. They definitely should. And all the issues going on there. But I think there are a lot of unique things that should be thought about and talked about, not only within Manitoba or the prairies, but also across Canada, because a lot of what is happening here, I think, is kind of a microcosm of bigger picture stuff across the country.
I think that's absolutely accurate. I think that this entire Manitoba election and the circumstances for it being called so early before being required to be called by law is really going under the radar. I mean, governments in power don't choose to go to the polls willy-nilly. There has to be a solid strategy behind this. And as I said in the show page description, there are those that say that this is fundamental to the big picture, whether you want to call it the International Democratic Union Organization's plan or just the general right-wing party brotherhood plan. There are people that are starting to talk about the opening of the Canadian Constitution, and the most important factor there is having 7 provincial governments that will agree. We do know that there definitely is a team around the First Minister's table these days with Jason Kenney, Doug Ford, Francois Legault, if you can make him happy. We have New Brunswick, we have Nova Scotia. The numbers are closer to amending the Canadian Constitution than anybody ever thought possible when it was made, the formula. Is this factoring into the political direction in Manitoba, or is this just something that nobody's talking about there? Are there problems with Manitobans that would overshadow these type of macro national issues?
Yeah, no, I don't think anyone is talking about the issue of sort of opening up the Constitution in Manitoba, outside of probably political scientists and legal scholars and those kind of things. I think there are a lot of issues, as is the case across Canada, which is, occupying people's headspace and that kind of thing. Like you bring up the early election call, and I think that is very interesting, kind of indicative of how it's been framed. So Pallister said that he wanted to call the election early, over a year early. So it's in September of 2019, obviously, and the election law didn't require it to be held until October 2020. And the reason he gave for that is because he didn't want to campaign during the 150th anniversary of the province of Manitoba, which is like a very curious thing, because here's this guy, and I don't think he's being entirely truthful, but this idea that, regular Manitobans care deeply about the 150th and don't want to have to, worry about, an election or something during that. And I don't think that is the case at all. I think a lot of people are concerned about the same things they are across Canada, whether it be employment or housing or issues around climate and those kind of things. And so I think if you ask a person on the street, what their number one or number two issue is, I don't think it would, really come to the constitutional question. There was a poll done during the last Winnipeg municipal election, and it was a poll done by the city itself, and they found that transit is the number one issue on people's minds within Winnipeg. And so I think that's it's a really local issue. And I think maybe there is a bigger conversation to be had about what this upcoming election may mean. And if Andrew Scheer wins at the federal level, what this could all kind of mean for the future of Canada as a confederation in terms of what that means from a constitutional question. But I guess we'll see. There is not a lot of conversation about that happening here.
Well, I find it rather antithetical that a political party in government would refuse to use the anniversary of their jurisdiction to capitalize for campaigning. That just makes no sense to me, but if that's the excuse he wants to give, well, okay, whatever. What happened in Manitoba in 2015, 2016 to enable Brian Pallister and the PCs to get control of the province?
So Manitoba had been governed by the NDP party for 16 straight years. Gary Doer had been elected as the leader of the NDP, or as a premier rather, in 1999. So the NDP had ruled previous to that, but this was by far sort of the longest, most recent stretch. So Gary Doer ruled for quite a while, and then he was replaced by Greg Selinger, who was the next premier. And so what happened there it basically comes down to very classic Manitoba politics. So Selinger pledged during the election that he was not going to raise the provincial sales tax. It was at 7%, and he said that he wasn't going to increase it. But in 2013, he did increase it to 8%. So that broke a key election promise. A lot of people were very upset about that, including people within his own caucus. So at the end of 2014, there was a group of 5 high-ranking ministers, including the ministers of finance and the ministers for job and the economy. Not backbenchers, like pretty influential people who threatened to resign if the PST wasn't rescinded, and they did. So they resigned from the ministerial posts. They served as backbenchers. And then after that, Teresa Oswald, who was the Minister of Jobs and the Economy, challenged Selinger for the leadership. And that was also challenged by Steve Ashton, who was the Minister of Infrastructure and Transportation. There was a leadership contest, and Selinger barely beat Oswald. It was 50.93% to 48.72%. So Selinger went ahead in the 2016 election as the leader of the NDP. They got beaten extremely badly. So in 2011, in that election, there was 55.7% of people who came out to the polls. In 2016, there was a slightly higher percentage, 57.4%, and the NDP got absolutely crushed. So the PCs came away with a huge majority, and David McLaughlin, who was the campaign manager for the PCs, wrote a sort of a postmortem about how the Conservatives succeeded. And he identified, sort of 4 key approaches. And so number 1 was to retain every, traditional PC voter, which makes sense. Second was to attract soft NDP, liberal and independent voters who, wouldn't vote NDP. The third was to hive off change voters who might be attracted to the Liberals. And the fourth is to remind what he called Gary Doer New Democrats of their current distaste for Selinger, and then maybe they will stay home. And it should be noted to the third point that the Liberals really don't have any sort of presence in Manitoba. They are a very inconsequential party. They do have elected members, but it is ultimately between the PCs and the NDP in this province. And so, yeah, the PCs won based on, just really stirring up resentment at this single percentage PST hike. And also, like any government that's been in power for that long can kind of be blamed for any number of issues. And, the PCs went really hard on concerns about deficits and debt and those kind of things. And they appealed to issues with healthcare and how Manitoba had some of the longest waiting times in emergency rooms in the country. As with every government, they pledged to improve that within, a term or two. That's ultimately what happened in 2016 in a nutshell. And so we've seen 3 years since that.
So basically what you're saying is the Manitoba Progressive Conservatives use the same old playbook that everybody across Canada in different jurisdictions has seen from the Conservative parties in the last 5 years. It was simply, this is unacceptable. We deserve so much better than this. Well, what are you going to do to improve it? Well, never mind. Look what they're doing.
Just to run through very quickly what they did promise in 2016. And so, the first page of their platform was, we want to make Manitoba the most improved province in all of Canada with better healthcare and education for you and your family. So the main issue that they talked about was, lowering the sales tax from 8 to 7%. They promised to cut ambulance fees in half. They wanted to create a task force to help shorten wait times for service in hospital emergency rooms. They would increase income tax brackets. They would reduce the deficit. They would boost funds for home-based daycare. And then, a big thing that we've sort of seen emerge is their commitment, in trying to reduce the deficit is to find what they call government savings. So about 1% of the entire budget within their first year in office. So that includes spending smarter is what they call it. So, cutting down on, the very visible expenditures like government travel. They wanted to improve tendering practices and do a value for money review of government. And then they, looking back, this is quite interesting, but, as with a lot of parties promised to do, they said that they would fast track the construction of 1,200 personal care home beds, create a dedicated stroke unit, develop a comprehensive mental health strategy. So they did promise big things for the healthcare sector, especially, and we have seen big things happen since then, but probably not quite the same as what they promised then.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I don't mean to read ahead of listeners here, but considering what they promised and what they delivered, these are not the same topics, are they at all?
No.
Well, what have they done? I mean, they came out and said, we're going to do all this. We're going to, the same old thing, make Manitoba great again. But
yeah.
What have they done compared to what they said they would do? Generally, I mean, we will get to specifics on the big ones, but
for sure,
considering their rhetoric about how they're going to improve everything, has it turned out that their only definition for the word improve means to defund, to sell off, to basically eliminate? If it's gone, it doesn't cost any money. Look how good we did.
Yeah, that's precisely it. And so their conception of improving is to flip, basically everything that they can to the private sector. And, their obsession, which has been the obsession of conservative parties for a very long time, is to return to what they call a balanced budget. Who the budget is balanced on the backs of is not really as big a concern for them. And so, yeah, very broadly speaking, it's been a process of a lot of service closures. We've seen a lot of privatizations. We've seen really big fights with public sector unions especially, and a lot of funding cuts. And the way that a lot of these have been delivered has been in a quite sophisticated way. Like, I compare this, and maybe it's just because it's the province over, but I do compare this to Ontario. And, of course, there is a lot more people in Ontario, so a lot more people affected and a lot more people organizing. But in the context of Ontario, we've seen the reverberations of some of the policy decisions across the country. There's been people talking about, Doug Ford and, what he's doing to education and healthcare, and all very, very rightfully so. So it has been interesting to contrast that with how Pallister's been able to get away with these things. He's done it very I would say quietly. He's done it sort of over the 3 years in a way which it angers constituents, but it is quite a targeted approach. He's been able to get away with a lot in a very short time, but while retaining, a lot of support, more so in the rural areas, because Manitoba is, it's quite a rural province outside of Winnipeg for the most part. He's still got pretty strong support in Winnipeg as well, in the wealthier areas or whatever. So we can get more into specifics about what's happened, but it has really been a process of getting rid of some of what some would argue are Manitoba's best programs, or the things that the NDP really worked hard to build and to address issues around poverty and around homelessness and around healthcare and all these kind of things. They came in very quickly and reversed that or cut that or just whittled it down to the point where it becomes ultimately ineffective, and the enthusiasm that people may have had for those kind of programs is lost over time. So, yeah, it's an intelligent but quite cruel process, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. This is the clinical precision that conservative governments seem to strive for, where, yeah, I agree. They don't care who bears the brunt, just as long as they can say, look at the bottom line. Aren't we fantastic? Are you already seeing in Manitoba the effects of these cutbacks, of these programs disappearing? Is it making a difference in the societal health of Manitoba? And is there any tangible amount of people saying, wait a minute, this is not right? Or do you think that by calling the election early, he's beating that reaction to the punch? He thinks he can get another term now before the pain gets too serious.
Yeah, I think that latter point is definitely right. Like, to use healthcare as an example, because that has really been their focus in terms of overhauling it and cutting back budgets very significantly, is that, it's all framed as a transition. So, the idea is that, the transition that we're undergoing is going to be painful in the short term, but it's going to be good for Manitobans in the medium to long term. So I think they are taking advantage of that sense. There is a lot of anger, and I think it depends on what community you're part of and who you talk to and everything, but I think there is a lot of anger about the closures of the 3 emergency rooms, which we can get into in a bit, as well as just the loss of other services, the urgent care clinics and the quick care clinics and these kind of things. So there is anger at that, but I think they are basically waving their hands at that and, kind of suggesting that, they may be outraged now, but this will be gone in a few years, and they, people will love us once the deficit is reduced as a result of these changes. People will get used to it. So I think by calling the election early, they're taking advantage of that, where the worst effects we're beginning to see, but we haven't maybe seen in quite as an acute way as we probably will in a year or two. I think they're also taking advantage of the overall disorganization of the Manitoba NDP, which I think, we'll also talk about later, but they are really struggling to coalesce around a coherent message outside of, we're not the PCs. And so I think as long as they can kind of balance those two things, I think they do have a really strong shot at winning. And so once again, I don't want to give them too much credit, because what they are doing is really devastating to the province, but they are approaching this in a very sly way. The timing of the election call definitely reflects how they're going about that.
James, recently you have written a very comprehensive piece in Canadian Dimension called The Devastation of Manitoba, an autopsy of Pallister's austerity regime. I found it to be very eye-opening, to say the least, and very complete. Well done. We're going to basically base our discussion on that because it is so comprehensive. The first subject I wanted to turn to is healthcare in Manitoba, and I will just quote from what you wrote in it. Deep and rapidly implemented changes to the healthcare system have been at the heart of Pallister government's obsession with, quote-unquote, balancing the budget. 3 of 6 emergency rooms in Winnipeg have been closed. Victoria Hospital in 2017, and Seven Oaks Hospital and Concordia Hospital in 2019. Each was converted to a 24/7 urgent care center designed to treat non-life-threatening injuries and illnesses, with emergencies treated at the remaining 3 emergency rooms. including an expanded ER at Grace Hospital. Now, the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority distributed leaflets and directed billboards to inform patients about which center they should visit. The health authority's vice president told CBC at the time that there is hope that people will self-determine whether they should instead go to an urgent care center. The overarching objective for the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority, now that governs healthcare regulation for the City of Winnipeg, the rural municipalities of East St. Paul and West St. Paul, and the town of Churchill for 2017-18 was to cut $83 million from its budget, representing a 3% cut. Another $36 million in planned cuts were unveiled for 2018-19, including cost reductions from laundry, food, patient beds, and staffing. Now, to me, that sounds like the first things they're going after are the things that can indeed be contracted out. I mean, like you said, Winnipeg, over 800,000, 3 emergency rooms for 800,000 people? That sounds very limited to me.
Yeah.
Now, this just doesn't sound like the results of what the progressive conservatives were touting on the campaign trail last time around, does it?
No, absolutely. And to rewind to 2016, Pallister was asked at the time, will you be cutting healthcare? And he said at the time, no, he wouldn't. So it is really stark to look at these numbers. And you read out the quote by the vice president of the health authority, and the billboards are everywhere. And so there's different colors indicating whether you should go to a walk-in, which is green, or an urgent care, which is yellow, or an emergency room, which is red. And there is really this messaging that it is the job of the individual to self-diagnose what their problem is. So it's like, if you have a broken bone, go to urgent care, don't go to emergency room. If you have, X ailments, go to this one and not that one. And it really does assume a lot about one's own ability to figure out what's wrong, because if you're in severe pain, if you think that you are facing, if not death, like we've all been in situations where things are really scary, and in a healthcare panic, you don't always make the completely rational decision. And so it is, you see these billboards and these leaflets everywhere. They were delivered to everyone's home. So it is very surreal to contrast that with what was said back in 2016, like you say.
It seems very strange to me. Well, I mean, I'm used to it being in Alberta, where the authority, the boards in charge of public facilities seem to side with the government of the day for their messaging. Did you notice back when the Selinger government was in, did you see anything coming from the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority that demonstrated what they believed, as opposed to now them speaking for what the Pallister government believes? I mean, like you said, this self-diagnosis, this is antithetical to what people think Canadian healthcare is. If you're in distress, if you're injured, if you're ill, you go to the place where you think you're going to get the best attention with the most resources. You're not asked to have a checklist. Well, I have this but I don't have that, so maybe I should go here. Is that putting the burden on people unfairly that they should, have a certain amount of medical background? Like, are they kind of imposing that this is your duty as a Manitoban now to not waste money?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. It's this very neoliberal, subjectivity, this idea that it really is up to the individual and the individual household to make the correct decision on behalf of the rest of society, even though, for a very long time, ever since I grew up, I was always told, don't go on like WebMD or don't consult these online websites for healthcare advice, because people who are not trained medical professionals are oftentimes not very good at that. Again, another sort of discursive practice of the provincial government to discipline people and to say that, if you pick the wrong place, you're wasting the money of your neighbor or of your community. And this is something that it's really like your fault that we're facing this deficit or that kind of thing. So it is a very strange process, which I don't think has got nearly enough attention because it is based in sort of discourse of very like individual decision making, and I don't think that is reasonable. I don't think it's fair, and it also imposes austerity in the messaging itself. That it really is the fault of people who make the incorrect decision that we have to pay for more doctors or more nurses or more beds or whatnot.
Well, again, going back to the topic of candidate Pallister saying that he would not cut health care, but yet I turn to an article from February 8th of 2017 from CTV in Winnipeg and Imad Agahi, 6 capital health projects cut by the Manitoba government, and they were all planned and seemed to be going ahead. And, during the campaign, oh, no, nothing wrong with this. Lac du Bonnet Personal Care Home, the Thompson Northern Consultation Clinic, the St. Vital Primary Care Access Clinic, the St. Boniface Blood Bank, the PA Primary Care Clinic, and a new Cancer Care Manitoba facility, which I think probably made the most noise. But yet they said they wouldn't do this. And then they used the familiar refrain, well, it's because of the guys before us. We had no choice. But yet, wasn't the NDP counting on financing all these? So how exactly, does that make any sense? Was that a harbinger of things to come?
Yeah, it was. And you're right, that did happen very, very early on. It's one of the first steps of, the healthcare reforms or overhaul, whatever we want to call it. Because Kelvin Goertzen, who was the health minister at the time, he said, we have to make choices to ensure that healthcare is sustainable today. It's sustainable 5 years from, and it is sustainable 10 years from now. This framing that the NDP were chronic overspenders, that they put the province into a situation where, you can't recover unless you make these cuts. Yet at the same time, they are really, they're rolling back, a bunch of taxes, and they're giving out tax handouts to more people, which I think we'll talk about later. But they painted this as an option of, we can basically have hospital facilities, but we will be put in major debt, which will be paying for many decades to come, or we can spend in an intelligent, sustainable way, which is the framing that they went with, was that, if we want to be able to sustain this, then we have to make these hard choices. The conservative framing of tightening the belts. It's good for everyone down the road. And yeah, these were really shocking cuts, and they didn't get that much attention at the time, I don't think, and they still haven't really to this day, because it's difficult for constituents to imagine what a great healthcare facility looks like if they don't have it in front of them. And so, we can look at something like the $300 million expansion to Cancer Care Manitoba. It would have been incredible, and I think it would have cut down on, wait times, and it would have given, faster attention to patients, and, all these many benefits. But for people who, can't see that in front of them, it is difficult to kind of think about. And same with Thompson and the PA, and those are all northern towns. And so once again, to return to sort of my previous point about, the North being really neglected by governments, it's even easier for them to do that, because then they don't even have to, they never go to the North, they never visit, so they don't have to really justify it to anyone. They just say, we can't afford this because of the NDP and because, there's not enough residents to justify it or whatnot. And so this was one of the very first things that happened, and it's very scary to look back, because those were some major commitments which would have improved the lives of many people. It would have provided opportunities for good work in the healthcare sector, and they're gone. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, looking at your article here, especially the parts on healthcare, I see the same old pattern that we've seen from austerity administrations, the small things, the things that affect not a great number of people, but it affects that number of people in a great way. You look at stuff like reducing coverage for the number of test strips for people with diabetes. You look at the fees for seniors to use services run by Winnipeg's health authority increased, basically doubled. A program to incentivize medical students to work in rural areas was ended. Universal health care for international students was repealed. Rumors of privatization of healthcare started right after the election. They started talking about privatizing MRIs and CT scans. They privatized outpatient physiotherapy and occupational therapy. They came up with new ideas for home care. Therapists were laid off. This one I found very cutting off your nose to pretend you have a face. More than a dozen nurses with expertise in burns, trauma, and intravenous insertions were laid off. You know, every once in a while we hear health ministers or heads of health boards talk about prevention, knowledge. Mm-hmm. This is what saves money in the long run. These are the programs that they chopped off first. So how does this make any sense? Ambulance funding was frozen.
Yeah.
There's so many things that take away from what they say they want to accomplish, but yet they turn around and do all this stuff and don't want to talk about it. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was Lifelight, the publicly owned air ambulance service that provides transportation for critically injured or ill patients outside of Winnipeg. And I think that's something people have to keep in mind. Winnipeg is basically in the southeast corner of Manitoba. Manitoba goes a long way north. I don't think there's ever been a jurisdiction that has been able to run an air ambulance service at a profit. That's not what it's for. But yet, did they really talk about this? No, they issued a request for proposals, and the 17 doctors who work with Lifelight refused to board the private services plans after the province grounded their own Cessna jets and laid off the pilots and maintenance workers. So this isn't a request for proposals. This is, we're no longer paying for it. Who's going to pick it up? Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think they were kind of counting on the doctors and the nurses who worked on it to refuse to fly, and then they can kind of point the blame at them when things go wrong. Look at these greedy doctors who are refusing to save people's lives because they aren't comfortable or whatnot, or they're not willing to make these sacrifices. But it was a shocking change. Lifelight was doing a really quality job of making sure that people outside of Winnipeg could access healthcare, and of course, it was a stopgap measure. There should be good hospitals and clinics and healthcare facilities in the north, and so people can go through treatments or be assessed or whatnot near or at their communities. I think that's a really important thing that should happen. But as long as that wasn't yet complete, which was part of what some of those capital projects were that we were talking about before in Thompson and Nepal. As long as those weren't complete, this Lifelight was really critical. And so I found this article where the CBC interviewed a doctor who was working near Dauphin, and they equated it to almost completing colonization with northern Manitoba communities. Like it really does cut off people from guaranteed access. And the issue with privatization, as we've seen time and time again, is it disrupts networks. So before we would have this public system in which there would be oversight and transparency over many parts of it. It would be consistently funded over time, and then, like you said, the priority would be quality care and not profit making. And as soon as you flip that to the private sector, the priority does become profit making, which, in terms of transporting sick or injured people long distances so that they can survive, that is a rapid shift towards American style healthcare, which we've seen erode the Canadian healthcare system for a very long time. But it feels like a very acute and racist, because Manitoba's north is predominantly Indigenous shift, which does have very real world consequences. A 53-year-old man from a First Nation near the Paw died in July. He was waiting for a Lifelight flight from the Paw to St. Boniface Hospital, which is in Winnipeg, and the air ambulance didn't show up for over 6 hours. And this was at the same time as doctors were refusing to board the planes. So this was all happening at the same time. And so he died as a result of that. So that's like a very tangible example of what happens when these sorts of things occur, when province or government prioritizes deficit reduction, over, maintenance and expansion of good public services, which may mean, raising taxes on the rich or on, wealthy corporations or that kind of thing, which we'll get into later. But I just really wanted to emphasize that, people are literally dying as a result of these decisions, and it's really horrifying.
Well, I mean, there is evidence that it is getting to a point where it's starting to sound like Manitobans are not impressed with this sort of thing. I turned to the Winnipeg Sun from May 6th of this year. Joyanne Persaga, nearly 4 out of 10 Manitobans feel health care has gotten worse. So, it does sound to me like Manitobans in general are saying, wait a minute, this isn't, I don't care. Like when it's my parents or my child or somebody who needs rapid medical care, I don't care that we saved $80-some million in Winnipeg last year. That's when the rubber hits the road. This poll showed that 38% of those surveyed believed services were getting worse, and while 8% weren't sure, 48% felt they stayed the same, and 7% felt they improved. I gather the 7% were donators to the PC party.
Right.
But, these numbers have really gone up because the same question in 2016-17, it was 20% who said the system got worse. And in 2015-16, it was 10%. So we've seen a doubling that fast.
Yeah.
But yet Pallister comes out and says he's received plenty of compliments and criticism about the province's controversial Winnipeg health facility transformation. But he refrained from drawing conclusions from the poll. Well, how convenient for you, Mr. Pallister.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is evidence that it's starting to create some rumbling in the everyday world of Manitobans. But again, is this just a tactic of calling the election while the voting's good before this stuff comes home to roost?
Yeah, I think it is. The consolidation of the emergency rooms is beginning to flare up in very pronounced ways. There was a lot of activism against the closure of the Concordia emergency room, which was quite encouraging to see. There was a lot of lawn signs, in people's front yards whenever you drive by, sort of bright yellow signs. And so it became a very visible issue in the area. It was still closed, but rather than converting it to a walk-in clinic, which was sort of the plan originally, they converted it to an urgent care center. And as we discussed before, the urgent care center is designed to treat people with non-life-threatening illnesses or injuries, people who self-diagnose and end up in an urgent care center. So a lot of people still want that emergency room reopened, but, I guess that's better than it being converted to a walk-in clinic. But St. Boniface Hospital, which still does have an emergency room, has faced some really severe overcrowding. So in June of this year, St. Boniface shut down its admission of patients with what they called non-life-threatening injuries or illnesses for almost 24 hours. And an emergency room doctor went public with what happened there, and he said he attributed it specifically to the conversion of Concordia into the urgent care clinic. As a result of that, patients were kind of flooding into the St. Boniface Hospital. And that same day, a woman died while waiting for surgery for over 4 hours. And so her daughter described it as they had left her sitting there bleeding out for hours in the emergency room. Once again, a very visceral, devastating example of what these consolidations have meant. And I think, like you mentioned the poll, I think people are aware of, what kind of impacts this is having on their healthcare. But healthcare is such a funny issue because if you're not visiting an ER on a semi-regular basis, which, hopefully people don't have to, or they don't have family members or friends who have to, it's something that you can kind of push to the back of your mind, especially if you are a person of affluence and you can afford to maybe go somewhere else to find treatment or those kind of things. And so for some reason, the PCs still have pretty overwhelming support in the polls. We can talk about polling later, but people's anger at the PCs is not severe enough to actually threaten their second term, which it looks like they're going to get at this point. And so that's pretty troubling. And then from an actual healthcare worker perspective, nurses are working a lot more overtime shifts. There's a lot of stress. The president of the Healthcare Authority described it as a valley of despair, which healthcare workers are experiencing. And at the same time, they had to undergo this healthcare bargaining unit reorganization. And so there's a lot of things for healthcare workers to have to try to keep on top of while all of this was happening. And so it has sounded like an extremely stressful process for people working in healthcare. And a lot of people have lost their jobs or had more work put on them because other people have lost jobs. And so it's been a really intense process for a lot of people within that sector.
Yeah, the other thing I'd like to touch on there is with the closing of so many facilities and the loss of jobs, the other same old program that we see from conservative parties was healthcare workers being forced to vote for new union representation. Consolidation of the bargaining units went from 190 to 36. Now, we've seen this time and time again from right-wing governments. Was this basically just to create chaos within the union community to maybe help prevent them from having the time and the funds to have an effective public campaign against what was happening to healthcare?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, to speak to kind of the intelligence of the process on this, because it is a dual sort of pronged approach, because the PCs have been warring with public sector unions since the start, and they've also been trying to administer these very severe cuts to healthcare. And so by doing this, the president of MGU, which is the Manitoba Government Employees Union, described it as a way to try and just create chaos within the union lives, and they pitted union against union. And so this meant that as opposed to, these unions, coming together and really trying to figure out what approaches they could take to fight back against this, they were forced to fight against each other for members. And that vote happened very recently. MGU, the government's union, lost 8,600 members in the process. And so, it does create these extreme tensions and resentments among unions. And at a time when, perhaps more than ever, workers should be, coming together to struggle as, a united front of the working class against austerity and against privatization and all these kind of things. They're forced to fight against each other. So it was a very clever, effective move. The only billboards that you'd see around town that would kind of, reference union politics or whatnot were by the healthcare unions, and they were trying to recruit members to vote for them in this vote. So, they would make vague references to, to stop the cuts or that kind of thing, but it wasn't really prioritizing education of public members who weren't part of healthcare unions or weren't unionized at all. It was very much trying to appeal to healthcare workers who are already unionized and had to make this big decision about which union they wanted to vote for. And so, it was a very clever move, and it seems to have worked really well.
Oh, divide and conquer never seems to fail somehow.
Yeah.
Another big issue with the Pallister government has been I won't call it a bait and switch, perhaps the more friendly term would be a ideological realignment concerning climate and the environment. On the campaign trail, Pallister was not militantly anti-carbon tax. He was not anti-emission limiting measures. He seemed to, at least he publicly said, that he understood the issue. But we've seen quite a different story once he got the keys. I mean, you wrote a piece in the Narwhal, came out on August 15th of 2017. And quite simply, you ask, where on earth is Manitoba's climate plan? And what did you find when you put this article together from what was advertised and what was delivered?
Yeah, it was quite interesting because, as you mentioned, Pallister didn't position himself as vehemently anti-carbon tax or vehemently anti-climate policy more broadly. Of course, that's changed since, as I can get into, but his campaign manager was David McLaughlin, who he served as chief of staff for Jim Flaherty, and he was involved with Brian Mulroney. So he's a longtime conservative sort of politico, but he also has chaired and has been involved in climate policy analysis and decision making, that kind of thing. And so his appointment to that role was quite intriguing. And he, Pallister had, pledged to kind of come out with this climate and green plan, which they did. And as I got at in that piece, it did take a really long time to materialize, and there were kind of rumblings that a lot of key sectors, namely agriculture, was going to be exempt from the carbon pricing approach. And, so it did come out late 2017. I like to think it was prompted by my article, but it almost certainly was not. And so, rather than going with the $50 per ton by 2022 price, which is required by the federal benchmark, they went with a flat $25 per ton right off the mark. But it would not increase over time, and it did exempt agriculture, which was a pretty big blow to carbon pricing. And the interesting thing about Manitoba's, sort of climate policy landscape is there are not many large emitters, and so compared to Alberta, where you have large oil sands mines and refineries and that kind of thing, in Manitoba we have some fertilizer production facilities and some landfills and that kind of thing, but very few that would qualify as a large emitter, and so that kind of complicated how this came to be. They proposed a $25 per ton thing, and then they came up with this math, which suggested that they should be able to get credits for all sorts of things, namely hydroelectric exports to the States and Saskatchewan, even though the entire point of carbon pricing is to incentivize people and governments to make low carbon investments so they don't have to pay the price. But nevertheless, they did introduce that, and then they announced about a year later that they were cutting out carbon pricing entirely. And so Pallister stood in the picture of, that kind of infamous Maclean's cover titled "The Resistance," and there was Scheer and there was Doug Ford, and Pallister stood in that, and the whole thing was framed around, the resistance or the opposition to the carbon tax. And so he completely changed his mind on that. And so Mark Hudson, who is a University of Manitoba sociologist, described that decision as an epic, even catastrophic failure of such leadership. Yeah, I don't know what happened. I don't know why he didn't come out of the gate with the framing that he did. It was probably to try to satiate some concerns that this is exactly what was going to happen. And he even the government paid a law professor to prepare expert advice on the constitutionality of a federally mandated carbon price. And at the time, the legal scholar said, yes, it is very likely constitutional. And so as a result, Pallister said, okay, we're not going to take this to court because it would be a waste of taxpayer money. And then, of course, he announced in early 2019 that they are indeed suing the federal government over the federal carbon pricing backstop. So even though they have this expert advice, even though, we've seen Court of Appeal rulings in multiple provinces rule that it is indeed constitutional, Pallister changed his mind and went from supporting some semblance of a carbon price to really opposing it, not only in the public sphere, but also in the courts. That's what happened there. And Manitoba is one of the few provinces where emissions are projected to continue rising. And, Manitoba's emissions profile is quite different than other provinces because of what I was talking about with the large emitters. It is significant, especially given that, every province has to play its part in reducing emissions to meet Canada's climate targets and those kind of things. And so there really is no plan to speak of in terms of emissions reductions or really key questions around electrifying transportation and home heating and improving public transit and all these kind of things. It's really just kind of been forgotten, and it really hasn't got much play in this election at all.
Well, the thing that really surprises me, I mean, yes, I agree. Manitoba does have a different footprint than many of its neighbors. I mean, there are very few, quote unquote, large emitters.
Right.
When you talk about exempting agriculture, when you talk about, for the most part, exempting commercial transportation, then what you're left with is what they call stationary combustion, which is basically citizens spending money on energy to keep warm and be mobile and things like that. I noticed that there's also been, with the rhetoric against the federal carbon plan, zero mention of the rebates to everyday people who would have to pay it over the year. I mean, we see it time and time again when a real study comes out that says, well, in a lot of provinces, for a lot of people, they're actually going to get back more than they're paying during the year. But yet I've failed to see a provincial conservative government yet somehow include that fact in their explanation. Moving forward.
Yeah, and it went even beyond that. Quite recently, Pallister announced that he was refusing money from the federal government that would come from the carbon price, and it would be directed to green projects in Manitoba, like hospitals and universities, and helping to kind of increase energy efficiency and that kind of thing. He refused that and said that he wouldn't be part of the scheme, which was quite shocking. It seems like he was veering more towards, I won't say denialism outright, but definitely denialist rhetoric, or kind of like a dog whistling approach to it. And so it seems to be getting even worse. Like he said, we won't be part of a hoax. The hoax, I think, intended in this is the idea that carbon pricing will be somewhat, I don't know, whitewashed by having these intended rebates, which will increase energy efficiency. But you say the word hoax within the context of climate change, and we all know what that means. And so that's quite scary in itself.
Yeah, I think I would describe his change as being hyper-partisan, because what I saw when he referred to the hoax, he said that this money being offered was nothing but an election ploy by the federal Liberals. But in fact, if Manitobans have paid into this plan, are they not deserving of the money back for the program's initiatives? I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. It just basically, to me, it sounds like, well, it's the guys that wear the red shirts that said this, so forget it. We're not playing ball. How does that help Manitobans? I have no idea. While we're on this topic, I wanted to just bring up Kiosk and Manitoba Hydro, because to a certain degree, I've noticed the same things in Manitoba Hydro that BC Hydro is now being exposed for. An awful lot of shady assessments, a lot of very quick and undescribed contracts, a lot of lack of permissions from Indigenous nations, but yet it's sold as we're moving forward. This is green energy. This is this is that. But yet it's not being created in an economically feasible way whatsoever. It doesn't matter what the label they put on this stuff is. It turns out costing Manitobans far more than other sources would. Is there still a problem with Manitoba Hydro remaining solvent, or is that a problem that maybe a government like the Pallister government isn't so anxious to solve?
Yeah, I mean, I think this framing of Manitoba Hydro as eternally debt-ridden does benefit, the Pallister government, because I think down the road they do want to kind of privatize this piecemeal. So they hired Gordon Campbell, who was previously Premier of British Columbia, to come and do what was effectively a consultation or review of both Kiosk and Bipole 3, which is a huge transmission line which is going to export hydroelectricity to the U.S. He was eventually relieved of his duties after sexual assault allegations, but it was indicative, his hiring was indicative of sort of an ideological alignment in which they see a public utility with a very controversial, and rightfully so, controversial past, but one that should be ultimately privatized in very small amounts. And so we saw this with what was previously called the Power Smart program. So it was a program to try to promote energy efficiency through a bunch of different programs. I mean, I know Alberta had a similar office very briefly. It went beyond just, giving people more efficient light bulbs. There were energy retrofits, and there were new furnaces and all these kind of things. And so they parceled that out, and they created this new crown corporation called Efficiency Manitoba. And they said that this would resolve the issue of there being a conflict of interest within the utility in which they're trying to sell electricity while at the same time trying to promote conservation of electricity. And so maybe there's a kernel of truth there, because it was administered by this government, which has its eye on privatizing as many kind of services as it can. It seemed to indicate that this is kind of the beginning of a parceling out process. And we saw perhaps confirmation of this, because the NDP found in 2019 that Efficiency Manitoba, the new Crown Corp, had been operating without any employees for nearly a year. So it went from about 100 staff at PowerSmart to no employees. And then as of April of this year, the PCs clarified that they had indeed hired 3 people for this Efficiency Manitoba. And what followed from that was fewer people using energy efficiency programs in 2019. There's declining attention from the government on providing these services. Fewer people know about them, fewer people have access to them. And so I think the other big question, which I didn't really get into, in the case of Kiosk, what is this electricity being generated for? And it's something that doesn't really get that much attention, but a lot of it is for exports. A lot of this electricity is getting exported. And some people would argue that's the good thing. We have these natural resources and we should tap into them so that other jurisdictions without them can decarbonize and that kind of thing. But I think there are some big questions about why we need that amount of electricity exports. And you kind of hinted at it, but why there aren't also similar investments being made in wind and solar, both of which Manitoba is very well suited for. Being a very sunny prairie province, why isn't Manitoba Hydro focusing on that, or some other utility, focusing on those resources as well? We did see the entire board of Manitoba Hydro resign in protest to Pallister refusing to meet with them, which was a pretty shocking decision, which also indicates that Pallister is trying to kind of whittle away confidence in the public utility by being able to point to that and say, see, they're unwilling to work with me, even though it is the direct result of me not meeting with them. So,
oh, I agree. Now, the last thing I want to cover about this is it can't stay dormant forever. It will come up. And back in July of 2017, there was, as we saw everywhere else, sooner or later, a campaign by the Manitobans against carbon taxes coalition. Mm-hmm. And when you look at who is involved in that, you find the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and the Western Canadian Wheat Growers Association. Right. So, that side of the quote-unquote grassroots appeared almost on cue, but what I certainly didn't expect, I don't know how many Manitobans did, on the morning of August 3rd, 2017, representatives from almost a dozen local organizations gathered on the steps of the Manitoba Legislature to officially launch the Manitoba Carbon Pricing Coalition. Now, a little bit different groups involved compared to the previous. Canadians for Clean Prosperity, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Climate Change Connection, Prairie Climate Center, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Manitoba, the Green Action Centre, and the Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition. Now, it sounds to me like these groups seem to have a little bit more of a, shall we say, holistic interest in the picture than the CFIB and the CTF and the wheat growers. Do you think that the Pallister government was surprised with the force of the people saying, no, stop this shit right now. Climate change is real. Were they surprised by that?
I'm not sure. I would like it caught their attention a tiny bit, but I don't think that campaign really had a lot of legs outside of its initial launch. There were some really smart and pretty well organized groups involved in that. Like you said, the CCPA and the IISD, all respectable organizations. But I haven't really seen much campaigning outside of that initial launch. I haven't really seen any leafleting or petitioning or that kind of thing. And maybe it does exist. It could very well, but I haven't really seen enough to suggest that it is building up much of a movement outside of kind of the air war, which, I think may have some importance, to kind of show that there isn't only one side to this discussion. But I think that one kind of petered out pretty quickly, unfortunately.
Oh, well, at least it was there to begin with.
Right. Yeah.
In some places, you don't even get that. Now, of course, the Pallister government, being one of the club of conservative governments in Canada, have we seen the same playbook as far as things go, like policing, prisons, harm reduction, I guess what you would call, quote-unquote, law and order issues? Is this the same old story?
It is. And I think it's important to note that this is a continuation from the NDP itself. The NDP, when Bill C-10, the tough on crime legislation under Harper first came out, Andrew Swan, who was the Attorney General at the time, embraced that, issued support for it, and said that Manitoba would find the money, whatever the amount, to cover the costs of Bill C-10. And so it's not like this all came to head with the Pallister government. We have definitely seen an acceleration of it. There were successful programs like a restorative justice program, which tried to keep people out of jail. As I mentioned before, Manitoba has the highest incarceration rate in the country of the provinces. It also cut a program that would help teach inmates, various trades that they could, use after they leave. And so, like a number of these programs were arguably very successful, and they were cut quite early on. They privatized the phone systems that prisoners use. So as opposed to it being free, they now have to charge, or they now have to pay $3 for every 15-minute phone call. And so, yeah, it has been really interesting to me that the issue of incarceration has not got any attention at all in this election from any of the parties. I think that's quite fascinating and troubling. And of course, it is happening at the same time as what has been framed by politicians and the media as a quote unquote meth crisis. There's opioid crisis in BC and in other provinces. In Winnipeg, it's an issue of meth use, and it has been framed as something that is very destructive to public order and to safety and all these kind of things. And the PCs have really, really pushed hard on this lately. So rather than supporting a safe consumption site, they have rejected that outright, using the exact same conservative framing as we see across the country. The framing of it as being enabling and of being detrimental to local neighborhoods and these kind of things. And there was a report done that it basically interviewed drug users, and this was done by the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority and various harm reduction organizations. And they talked to drug users and asked, what programs do they need, what supports do they need, and it found that 80% of drug users are likely or very likely to use a safe consumption site. And when Pallister was presented this report in question period, he tossed it on the ground behind him. He was seen leafing through it after that, but it was pretty clear that he had quite a bit of disdain for this idea. And then later, the health minister said about this study that the people who participated in it, quote, wanted snacks, and quote, we do not believe that would be the basis on which to draw conclusions about the safety of such meth injection sites, which are not called for by any expert. We probably know quite well that there is a lot of scientific evidence supporting safe consumption sites as improving, responses to overdoses and improving access for drug users to various services, whether it be housing or healthcare or mental health services or all those sorts of things. And so they leaned in very, very heavily to that kind of rhetoric, while at the same time calling for more policing in Winnipeg. They committed $10 million to quote unquote reduce crime in Winnipeg's downtown. And there's a long trajectory of what that means within the context of the MTS Center, which is where the Winnipeg Jets play, and the gentrification of the downtown core. I won't go into that now. There's a really great book called Stolen City by Owen Taze, which I would recommend anyone who's interested in this history check out. And then when we saw the legalization of cannabis, the PCs did something, I'm not sure if it happened anywhere else in the country, but they went full bore on, the reefer madness. There were kind of an infamous poster went up where it said street cannabis isn't worth the risk. And it was a skull and crossbones, but the crossbones were two joints. And then there was another poster where it suggested that smoking marijuana can be addictive. And then they showed, I think it was 4 rows of what's implied to be coke, but they're actually joints. And so, drawing this link between, marijuana use and addictions. And they were criticized somewhat for that, but I think a lot of people just laughed it off, but I think that was quite a concerning framing of, we don't have to go into the history of the way that cannabis has been framed, but, it really is regurgitating rhetoric from, even a century ago, which is really quite wild to see unfold and be led by the provincial government and then them not really face any kind of consequences. So to answer your question, is this kind of, a continuation of conservative law and order? It absolutely is. I think they are coming up with some pretty horrific additions of their own to it, especially within the context of policing and perceived safety within the context of Winnipeg specifically. But it is very much like kind of a through line from previous administrations.
Well, the thing that I think it demonstrates is there is a basic explanation from conservatives that all issues of addiction, of illicit drug availability and use is not a health issue. It's a criminal issue.
Right.
And I think that is the fundamental difference of how you play the game on how you deal with it. Because, of course, law and order, you're breaking the law. You don't, right away, it dehumanizes the people involved. And like you said, I mean, there is reams of evidence of the beneficial good of safe consumption sites, whether they be for opioids or methamphetamine or anything else. I mean, silly me being a humanist and all, I just assume that one of the functions of government would be to prevent people from dying accidentally.
Right.
And we've just seen the stupidity come out in force in Alberta over the weekend with the Associate Minister for Addictions and Mental Health in Alberta saying that he thinks naloxone is an enabler. So when you have this kind of ideology coming from the seat of government, it's pretty hard to get ahead to actually save lives. So once again, the Pallister team is true to form, I guess. I find it interesting they seem to have $10 million for increased enforcement, but yet it was revealed that the Manitoba government had received $4.1 million from the federal government to fund addictions treatments for people specifically using methamphetamine, but they hadn't spent it. This isn't about dollars and cents. This is about ideology, in my opinion.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And to link back very briefly to the healthcare cuts, there was something that I said this repeatedly, but it didn't get much attention, was the closure of the Miscordia Health Center, which had an urgent care center within it. And a lot of low-income people in the area, and including people who use drugs, relied on services that provided. It wasn't always explicitly harm reduction. It was oftentimes just nurses being available to talk people through certain situations. But they closed that, and so the issues around harm reduction and cracking down on drug use and these kind of things can be seen outside of what you're talking about drug use as a criminal issue rather than a public health issue, because the closures of these healthcare facilities have a direct impact on people's ability to find assistance as well.
Now, the next major section in your Canadian Dimension piece is regarding labor in Manitoba. And like we see from so many governments of this stripe, there has been a war on organized labor since the day they got the keys. It started near immediately with interference in the 2016 strike by the University of Manitoba Faculty Association. And eventually, the Manitoba Labor Board ruled that the university engaged in an unfair labor practice by allowing itself to be covertly forced by the province to withdraw a salary offer and instead implement a wage freeze. Now, that was just the start of things rolling, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And the obsession with the wage freeze was, continued with the implementation of a 2-year wage freeze for all public employees. So what they did with the UMFA strike was they, forced the university to comply with this bigger vision. The province implemented this wage freeze, and now a bunch of public sector unions are suing the province for legislation. Yeah, things have got really, really dicey there. There's been a number of pretty big protests outside the legislature over this because the wage freeze is seen as illegitimate and, obviously breaking a whole bunch of expectations and rules around, fair bargaining practices and that kind of thing. And at the same time, the government eliminated card check certification, which means that, if a certain percentage of workers voted that they wanted a union, I think it was 65%, they would be automatically issued a union certification. And so they replaced that with sort of the infamous secret ballot process, which means that the threshold for the vote was lowered to 50%, but it gave extra time before it happened. But basically what this means is that it gives more time for bosses or for management to interfere. And Press Progress found that the result of this is that the number of failed union drives in Manitoba has tripled since it was implemented. It's it's a difficult sort of policy to educate people about, but it is a really important one. The president of MGU explained it as it allowing the employer time to obstruct their choice through intimidation and coercion. So the idea is that once you've made the vote, that should count. There shouldn't be another vote. There shouldn't be more time for that to happen. Been big layoffs at the Crown Corps, including Hydro and Liquor Lotteries and MPI, which is the insurance company. And there's sort of more things coming up probably in their second term, which includes privatizing the mediation services if there is mediation required between an employer and a union. And so, there's been a lot that has happened. I think the healthcare bargaining unit consolidation has got a lot of recent attention, but I would argue that the card check certification has not got as much attention as it should, because that really does impede union organizing in a very significant way. And we also just saw in the context of BC, the NDP didn't bring in card check certification because of opposition from the Greens. So this is a very hot button issue that I think more people should be talking about for sure.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm looking at that press progress piece from the end of July this year, and it is an analysis because, there's been enough time has gone by to see what the effect is of the changes the Pallister government made. And as you said, you look at Manitoba's failed union drives. In 2015-16, it was 4. 16-17, it was 4. In 2017-2018, it was 12. You compare that with what happened in the Alberta of Rachel Notley's NDP when they brought back card check certification. The successful union drives over the 4 years in Alberta went from 40 to 104. So it seems very plain to me that this is a completely political, ideologically driven type of policy. Yeah, I agree. I think it's pretty obvious what side the Pallister government is on. And it should be getting more noise, but unfortunately it's not. Again, like you mentioned, these mandatory cuts to Crown corporations, just cut your workforce, just like that, regardless of the revenues that the Crown brings in or the services that are in its mandate. Just have less people that we give checks to. It seems ridiculous. And of course, there's evidence that, like many other places, I remember it back with Ralph Klein in the 90s already. Things that have traditionally been done by provincial workers, be it road work, be it all kinds of things like that, translation services, the provincial tree nursery. Well, we're just going to privatize all that stuff. But yet they love to say there's only one taxpayer. Well, then why are you giving it to someone else to put their profit margin on top of the service? How does this help people or save money? But then, like I said, this is nothing new. Now, the next section of your piece in Canadian Dimension is on housing and social supports. Even in the little bit of time I've spent in the city of Winnipeg, I could see almost the wrong side of the tracks mentality. Yeah. It's not getting any better, is it?
No, definitely not. As I mentioned in the piece, the cost of housing is continually increasing. Manitoba does have rent control, but as in many places, landlords do have means of getting around that rent control quite easily. Between 2013 and 16, shelter costs increased by 25.8%, which is quite significant. And, like people often talk about Winnipeg as a fairly cheap city to live. Depending on where you're living, it and how many people you're living with, it arguably still can be. But this is changing very quickly, and especially for people who are in low-income situations. And so at last count, 21% of households in Winnipeg, so 1 of every 5, are in unaffordable housing. 39.5% of people renting are in unaffordable housing. Then there's other issues around the actual quality of housing or the suitability, which is to do with how many people are in how many rooms. And at the same time, the minimum wage has not been increased at a sufficient rate. And so it was $11 in 2015. It's currently $11.35. It's going up to $11.65 on October 1st. So that's 65 cents in 4 years. And so inflation is effectively eroding that. And then the CCPA calculated that for someone earning minimum wage, they have to work over 63 hours per week to afford a one-bedroom apartment in Winnipeg. So it's quite dire. The PCs have cut a bunch of supports for people who are in low-income housing situations. So that includes rent assists, which was a means of basically subsidizing rent for people. I mean, there's been no social housing spending at all, really. And then there's been a privatization or an offloading of social housing responsibilities. And so there's a big apartment complex which a bunch of low-income renters had been effectively evicted from due to concerns around, I think it was concerns around infrastructure of the actual housing unit itself, and the province sold that off. And they have, they've just failed to keep up with any semblance of actual demands for social housing at all. And so, that's kind of the situation. They have not really committed to improving this whatsoever. And that, unfortunately, that kind of transcends the PCs. The PCs are definitely doing the most damage, but there aren't really any parties who are committing to really changing this in any sort of drastic fashion. So, so that's the housing front. And then there's been a lot of cuts to various social supports and community organizations.
That opinion piece you speak of was in the Winnipeg Free Press on May 8th of this year, and it was by Professor Shauna McKinnon, and she said that the demise of Neighborhoods Alive was inevitable. And she does say that, it strategically targeted poor neighborhoods. It was designed in collaboration with the inner city development community, initially focusing on Winnipeg's major improvement zones. Brandon and Thompson were included early on, followed by Flin Flon, The Pas, Portage La Prairie, and Selkirk. It was one component of a long-term social and economic strategy to support community-driven revitalization and renewal efforts. Now, to me, that sounds like, according to traditional conservative doctrine, that would be something you would be striving to achieve.
Right.
To enable more of your citizens to be fully contributing members to society and the economy. But yet, as she concludes, it was an NDP project, so it has to go.
Right.
These ideological decisions, without regard for the people they affect, are they something that was done by other party governments in Manitoba, or is this a conservative phenomenon there?
No, I definitely think it was done by the NDP. There's different issues for sure. In the sort of the history of the NDP, there's two really key things. I think I've kind of touched on both of them at some point, but one was the expansion of hydroelectricity and the dams up north, which absolutely devastated a lot of Indigenous communities. It displaced and destroyed local economies. And that was done in the 70s and 80s, and it kind of continues to this day. There are more quote-unquote partnerships with Indigenous communities more recently with the Manitoba hydro projects, but I think the actual economics and the actual benefits are quite contested about what they're going to get from it at the end of the day. And then there's also the piece about incarceration, where the NDP really went hard on this law and order trajectory, and they really tried to sell themselves as committed to public safety and whatnot, and the result of that was the highest incarceration rate in Manitoba, and once again destroyed communities, predominantly Indigenous. I think both of those speak to these ideological commitments to what they perceive as being popular or in the benefit of the province. And when we speak of the province, it usually means white suburban communities. And so we've seen that throughout the NDP reign. That's not to say the NDP didn't do some good. We were just talking about Neighborhoods Alive. Programs like that were very good, were very beneficial, but there were also these other adjacent, ideological commitments, which were extremely destructive. And I think that does make it difficult going into this election. And we can get into this in a bit, but when the NDP kind of doesn't acknowledge that history or doesn't even commit to rectifying that, I think it makes it difficult for people who have concerns about those histories to get behind them.
The political mindset of yesterday doesn't matter. We don't know anything about that.
Right, exactly.
The next major section of your piece in Canadian Dimension was about the attacks on the education system in Manitoba, which have been non-stop from day one. Is there a way to summarize what's happened there?
Yeah, I basically equate what is happening in education to the very early phases of what happened in healthcare in their first term. So very briefly, they eliminated the legislation that restricted class sizes for K-3 classrooms. So previously it was restricted to 20 students, and now it's basically open-ended. It's at the discretion of the school boards themselves. They've had repeated cuts, and this is for both K-12 and post-secondary. They've increased funding to elementary and high schools by 0.5% in 2019 and 20, which means that inflation effectively erodes that increase. They closed the Manitoba Curriculum Support Center, which was basically a library for teachers, especially for rural or northern teachers. They have appointed a consultant whose recommendations recently resulted in Nova Scotia abolishing elected school boards. So this is a pretty serious thing to watch in the second term of the PC's form government. And then the universities and colleges have also faced tuition hikes as a result of the PC's opening that up. They now allow a 5% per year plus inflation hike. They also eliminated the tuition fee income tax rebate and advanced tuition fee income tax rebate. So this was another great thing that the NDP introduced. So it meant that there's a 60% tuition tax rebate over 6 years for university graduates, and encouraged people to stick around in Manitoba after they graduated. So it's kind of a backdoor way of decreasing the amount that one pays for university tuition, although it'd probably be easier just to pay for it in the first place. And then there was, so post-secondary tuition in Manitoba rose by 6.5% in 2018, which is almost double the national average. And then there was an access, it was called the Access Programs. So it's designed to make post-secondary more accessible for Indigenous and Northern students. That was cut. Basically, as I mentioned, I think, kind of going forward, this is going to be really the issue to watch. The PCs have kind of, actually just today, they announced that they are going to abolish property tax for education in Manitoba, which I think theoretically is fine. I don't think that education should be tied to property taxes, but at the same time, the Manitoba government under the PCs clearly has no plan to replace that funding. So we could be looking at hundreds of millions of dollars lost for annual education funding. So I think already we're beginning to see the education system eroded in the same way that the healthcare system was, which is pretty scary.
Well, again, on that front, the people directly involved, just like the healthcare workers mobilizing and protesting, the teachers themselves have been doing that across Manitoba. I mean, I refer to a large protest in Thompson in June of 2018. And I find it rather interesting that, governments, when they like to pass off, oh, yeah, we're increasing funding, 0.5%.
Right.
No mention of the existence of inflation in the world we live in. But yet when it comes time for students to pay more, inflation's always included in that calculation.
Yeah,
what
exactly.
A surprise. What a surprise. My goodness. Unbelievable. But again, consistent. Now, the other issue, I mean, I used it as kind of a snark in the slideshow, was I showed a picture of the flooded Omnitrax-owned rail line going to Churchill. And it was over a year that there was no rail line to Churchill. I mean, that just seems like draconian, in my opinion. How could you not fix this? They are isolated. But yet again, as I said in the picture, the Pallister government did absolutely nothing that would help normal people, but by doing nothing, they certainly helped the corporate ownership of the rail line. Again, I see it as rather partisan, trying to blame it all on the feds. The feds finally did get something done, but certainly with no assistance from the Pallister government. Is Churchill a sign of what's been going on outside of Winnipeg, which is obviously the population and political center of Manitoba?
I think it definitely is. It was kind of a really shocking combination of privatization, because the rail line was privatized many years ago, and also the impacts of climate change. And we can't attribute any one extreme weather event to climate change, but this kind of the flooding out of the rail tracks and the way that, because it was owned by a private Denver-based multinational, was quite the reminder of what kind of the future of Manitoba may hold if things don't change quickly. And this is especially the case in the north, as you mentioned. So Churchill is accessible by air, but its entire economy is based around rail. To bring tourists, to bring researchers, to bring goods and supplies. And Churchill's also, it's Canada's only Arctic seaport. So even for a conservative government that thinks that it cares about sovereignty or military or trade or like any of these things, you would think that Churchill would be prioritized as a community which is worth guaranteeing access to. So it took a really, really long time for that to be resolved, and Pallister basically just sat on his hands and refused to intervene, let alone offer to actually buy it, and if the province was to have that as a crown corp or as an asset, which it could guarantee access to Churchill and reap all the benefits from that. And then we also saw the same in Thompson. Thompson is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a mining town. It was basically built by mining companies, and it is facing a really uncertain future because a lot of the mines are closing. A lot of the people who worked mining jobs are losing jobs. So there is it's called a mining community reserve fund, and the idea is that it helps support these communities as the mines close. And the Pallister government is basically refusing to give money that these municipalities arguably need, and Pallister has refused to meet with councillors or the mayor from Thompson. So there's a lot of resentment there, from what I can gather, in terms of Pallister's perceived orientation towards the north. He will sometimes make reference to mines or to the resource jobs and that kind of thing, but when it really comes down to it, there's very little concern by Pallister in terms of what happens to these people when the mines close, or when they're if the train tracks get washed out. What happens to these people? There has not been a strong answer outside of just sheer neglect.
Well, on the one hand, I think it just might have something to do with the Ashton family and the fact that Nikki Ashton represents Churchill Kiiwetinoong. Again, I agree with you. It's because, like you said, okay, so let's say some climate event does happen to the on the tracks line, and now the multinational corporate owner says, oh, well, it's simply not profitable. We're abandoning it. And then the provincial government says, well, you're the owner. Yeah, well, you can do that. This is just not, it's, in my mind, it's not the function of government. The next section of your piece in Canadian Dimension is Indigenous. I'll just quote your first sentence because it is complete. It says, almost every issue discussed in this article disproportionately impacts Indigenous peoples in Manitoba, whether it's poor access to health care, criminalization and over-incarceration, or lack of access to well-paid unionized work. Yet the PCs have taken on a particularly adversarial relationship with Indigenous peoples that is worth briefly discussing. The thing that really drew my attention to this, and I hope other Canadians, was events of just a couple weeks ago with some rather interesting comments from Premier Pallister, him saying that his party is engaged in more meaningful reconciliation than the NDP has ever done. But surprisingly enough, depending who you ask, this hasn't stopped the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs from endorsing the New Democrats in the upcoming election. So was this just Pallister trying to blunt the message of the Manitoba Chiefs? Or is this a dig at the NDP leader, Wab Kinew? Or what exactly was this about? Because if you look at the statement that Brian Pallister knows more about reconciliation than anybody else representative in Manitoba, seems rather ludicrous to me.
Yeah, and this is one of the very few instances where it does seem like Pallister kind of loses his focus on being this really smart, kind of cool, sly, conservative leader, because this isn't the first time that this has happened. Quite early on, he was slammed for, out of nowhere, bringing up Indigenous hunting rights, specifically night hunting, and he said that this issue was going to spark a race war, which is extremely concerning sort of rhetoric. And so then that continued with what you mentioned about this idea that Pallister has engaged in genuine reconciliation. And keep in mind that Wabkanu is Indigenous, like the leader of the NDP is Indigenous. So that's a really peculiar thing to say. And then he also alleged that Wabkanu has been handed more benefits than any premier in the last 60 years in this province. And, apparently he was referencing Wabkanu's somewhat affluent upbringing, but, in the context of the way that Indigenous, like racism against Indigenous people and dog whistles work, just like we were talking about with the hoax and the idea of climate policy, bring up the word benefits. It kind of signals to racists in Manitoba that, this is something that is bad and that it's, that Wabkanu is suspect and all these kind of things. So it's really concerning. Again, he kind of got away with these things. Like, I think there was some criticism on the day of or the day after, but it hasn't really stuck. He seems to be able to get away with more of these things, as the campaign goes on.
Well, I mean, immediately there were people who know far better than Mr. Pallister what the reality is in the Indigenous situation in Manitoba that came out and said, what the hell is he talking about?
Yeah.
But again, as you mentioned, it's the corporate press in Manitoba that doesn't seem to give equal shrift to the other side of the statement. Even Wabkanu, his comments about it were, I thought, very well measured because he was definitely on the defensive, having to speak from this point. He said, we might have had spoons in our house, but they weren't silver. It just seems to be very, no other word for it, racially motivated.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to reinforce the colonial benefactor model.
Yep.
And there's nowhere to go on that. I guess it works with your demographic, if that's what you're looking to appeal to. But I think to the public at large, comments like that are reckless. But unfortunately, he may not pay the price for it, correct?
No, I agree. And also it's very interesting and funny to contrast that with the fact that Pallister himself owns one of the biggest houses in Winnipeg. He owns a $2 million, 9,000 square foot mansion. And then maybe even more infamously, he spends a lot of time at his beach house in Costa Rica. The NDP recently found that he spent 128 days during his 3-year premiership at Costa Rica. And, to be fair, like none of that was when the legislature was sitting, but still it definitely seems to indicate his priorities. So all of that is quite fascinating. But yeah, you mentioned that he might not face the consequences. Polling does suggest that they're going to win. So a poll that was released on Saturday found that 40% of decided and leaning voters say that they plan to vote for the PCs. 29% say they plan to vote NDP, 18% for the Liberals, and 10% for the Green Party. And so in Winnipeg, the PCs and the NDP are basically tied, but outside of Winnipeg, the PCs have the support of about half of all voters. And so, yeah, it definitely looks like they are cruising to a victory. It might not be quite as decisive as in 2016, but it does look like they're gonna win quite heartily. So it looks like we're in for another 4 years of this, or 3 years unless they decide to call another early election.
And this would be an article in the Winnipeg Free Press by Larry Cush. I'm looking at those numbers. I guess this is a result of the way we do elections in Canada, the first past the post, with the rural ridings being decidedly progressive conservative. That is a certain advantage. I mean, I understand that Winnipeg is the battleground. It's where most of the people are, but it's a limited number of seats. When you can bribe all the people out in the country with either rhetoric or whatever sort of old stock messaging you want to give, as we've seen over the last couple of decades with the members of parliament that are elected from rural Manitoba, we know what works. Do you think that there's, well, I mean, we're getting late. We're in the last week now, but do you think there's anything that the NDP could do to improve their chances, or have you got any things that they have already failed to do that could improve their chances?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Like, I think what the Manitoba NDP have effectively done is sort of the Hillary Clinton type campaign where, I'm not Trump, we're not Pallister. So as a result, their main pledges are like, we're going to go back on the hospital closures. We're going to make sure that, auto pack fees, like car insurance fees, don't go up. They recently vowed to offer $350 rebates, like hydro rebates for every resident. They said that they're going to add 5 acute care beds, even though Manitoba has lost well over 100. And so it does feel very kind of incrementalist. And for people who maybe sat home last election, it doesn't really seem like they're offering much more that would convince people to actually show up to vote this time, especially given the presence of the Green Party in some ridings. The riding that I'm in has a candidate who appears to be going quite strong and is doing a lot of door knocking. So it does look like some of their popularity that is left might be getting chipped away at by the Greens. So in terms of what they could or maybe should be doing, I would say, committing to a massive expansion of healthcare funding. So not only reopening the ERs and the quick care clinics, but really dedicating themselves to improving access in the north, stuff like international students back on healthcare programming, or climate change. There's been a lot of really interesting stuff around like student strikers, like climate strikers. So responding to some of their demands, improving public transit, improving access to electrification of transportation and home heating, and like really looking at this as a challenge which is not only demanded of us because of Canadian climate targets, but also something that's going to generate a lot of good jobs, good unionized jobs. And to speak of unions, the NDP have pledged a $15 minimum wage over effectively 4 years. And so yesterday, the Manitoba Liberals outflanked them on that and said that they're going to implement it within 2 years. And so, I think really accelerating the implementation of a minimum wage, going beyond $15 is very important. Reintroducing card check legislation, strengthening health and safety regulations, improving scheduling laws, all these sorts of things. And then really prioritizing social housing, just a really big build out of social housing, not only in Winnipeg, but across the province in the north, rent control, anti-eviction measures, all these sorts of things. And the question, of course, becomes, how do you pay for this? There is a lot of wealth in Manitoba. It does get, I think, misunderstood a bit because of what we were talking about at the very beginning of the show. Manitoba is a small province. You think of it as something that doesn't really have a lot of wealth or affluence, but there are a number of families who can afford to pay more. I think it could be argued. So I looked at these numbers, and so this is all after-tax income. And so these people have already been taxed, and they still have this amount of money. Almost 100,000 households in Manitoba earn $100,000 and over, and 26,000 households earn more than $150,000. So again, after taxes. You've got big companies like Bell MTS. MTS used to be a public utility, was privatized in the 90s, and then Bell bought it. They're making a ton of profits in Manitoba. Great West Life is a big insurance company. Pallister is very close with insurance companies. They are making a lot of money as well. So there's a lot of potential for higher taxes on rich families, rich households, rich corporations, which would help pay for some of this stuff. And of course, the flip side of that is deprioritizing failed strategies like policing and incarceration and things which are breaking up communities and are terrorizing communities, and putting fewer resources into that and more resources into housing and healthcare and mental health supports and all these kind of things. And so I think I don't think a party wins or loses purely based on the platform. I think it's a lot bigger picture than that, in terms of how they're organizing their relationship with unions and religious organizations and all these kind of things. But I think having a really ambitious platform which people feel that they can relate to and feel like it will really tangibly improve their lives is a really important factor in that. So those are just a few ideas off the top of my head.
So basically what you're saying is not necessarily that the previous NDP governments or the current NDP party really have a silver bullet. Just using common sense and reversing a lot of the austerity would go a long way to improving Manitoba immediately, but it seems unlikely that there is a political will from any quarter to get serious about doing that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And not only would it improve Manitoba, but I think it would also improve their chances of actually winning an election. Because how it's looking right now is that the NDP are not going to do particularly well in this election. And I think that is in part because they are not really offering an ambitious package of policies. And so if they actually have interest in, maybe making a comeback, embracing some of the language that we're seeing in the U.S., maybe not, word for word, but, a lot of the push for things like a Green New Deal, or things like, decommodifying housing, or really taking on student debt and tuition crisis, just like really, really prioritizing these things, I think would obviously be incredible for low-income, young people, Indigenous people in Manitoba, but would also just be genuinely beneficial for the party if they actually care about winning again.
I guess we should know by now that political parties don't campaign to necessarily improve their jurisdiction. They campaign to achieve power.
Yeah, that's exactly right, yeah.
I don't think anybody will be surprised by a returned Pallister majority. Do you see any way, as some of the polling indicates, that it will not be as large of a majority this time? And if so, how many parties are we going to see in the Manitoba legislature, in your opinion?
I think we'll see 4. I think the PCs will win a majority. I think the NDP will resume opposition. The Liberals will maybe get a few seats, and I think I'd suspect that Dave Nickards in Wolseley, who is the Green Party candidate, will very likely win. So I think we will see 4. I think that'll be really interesting because I think it will just bring a bit more diversity of priorities. Like, for example, the Green parties have pledged to introduce fare free transit. So, obviously the Greens aren't going to form government, but I think it would be really beneficial for just public discourse to have someone like that prioritizing those sorts of issues. The Manitoba Liberals have talked about the Manitoba, or it's called the MPMP, so it's the Manitoba Provincial Nominee Program. It was a very well-established program for immigrants to come here to work, and the Pallister government introduced a $500, what people call the head tax. So basically just an additional tax on top of people for successful applicants to this program. So the Manitoba Liberals have pledged to rescind that and to open up the program for family members as well. And so that's something that none of the other parties are talking about. So I think having those parties would be really helpful. And yeah, it does seem pretty clear that the PCs are going to win. It will be, if the last 3 years are any indication, I think the next 3 or 4 are going to be equally as scary and destructive. Here's hoping that the 3 parties who are not the PCs figure out a way to work together and really push back against these further cuts and privatizations.
Well, the Manitoba election is next week, September 10th. We will see what happens. I think we're safe to assume there will be no ground-shaking surprises, but still, things will change. It'll just maybe take a little bit of time to figure out who and what will change. But James Wilt, I thank you very much for your depth and your breadth of knowledge on the Manitoba situation, for informing the VIP audience on what the hell's going on in Manitoba. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. It's not often that people pay attention to Manitoba, so it means a lot.
My pleasure. Thank you. And there we go. There's the interview with James. Like you said, Tuesday, September 10th, is Election Day in Manitoba. Advance polling has started. For the numbers side of it, 57 seats in the Manitoba Legislature. On dissolution, the majority PC government had 38 seats. The opposition NDP had 12. Manitoba Liberals had 4. And there were 3 independents. So 29 is the magic number. That doesn't seem to be at risk from anything I've seen. We'll see what happens. Thank you, James. I hope people have a little more Manitoba knowledge now. I certainly do after doing this show. That's it for tonight. As I said at the opening, holidays are over. We'll be heading straight for the October federal election now on the view up here. There may be a diversion or 2 along the way, such as the annual November 5th show. Not willing to say anything about that yet, although I do have one hell of a good idea. We'll see. About my holiday, just because I wanted to say this. First of all, to the Magna Golf Club in Aurora, Ontario, congratulations. Outstanding job in hosting the Canadian Pacific Women's Open from the LPGA Tour. Tremendous course. Outstanding course. Visually, as far as the skill it takes to navigate it. Outstanding course, especially considering that last year was the shittiest course I've seen this tournament played on. I've been to this tournament 10 out of the last 13 years. Last year was the absolute worst. This year was the best. Good job. And of course, Aurora being in the GTA, I did manage to meet 6 tweeters. 4 for the first time, but that was fun as well. There were more, but I just couldn't, not enough days. Couldn't drive east. Sorry. Maybe next time. Who knows? And I can't resist saying it. Wascana Country Club, Regina, Saskatchewan, you have been shown up to be nothing but a parking lot par 3 course. Although keep in mind, Magna Golf Club is hardly a public facility. I would like to thank the directors and management for letting us common people onto your course. It was outstanding. Well done. Canada's Wonderland. Pretty cool place. Just a couple roller coasters. And I must say that it will be a highlight that I will not forget of going 92 miles an hour on Leviathan. Good time. For regulars of Wonderland, if you haven't been on the new Yukon Striker yet, the lineups are worth it. Great dive coaster, brand new. The ride is so smooth. It's beautiful. Compare that to Behemoth, which is now 11 years old, getting just a little bumpy when you hit that 77 miles an hour. But regardless, a good time was had. That's it. No more personal, silly anecdotes. No more topic material for tonight. Thank you to James Wilt. And thank you for listening to The View Up Here. We'll see you next week. Good night.